May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Grant Wood, W-O-O-D. His dates are 1892 to 1942. Put in the first slide, please. This slide, I'm sure, is quite familiar to most of you, either having seen it as a piece of artwork or possibly in its more degenerated form as an advertisement for some cornflakes. But companies seem to have a habit of hanging on to great works of art over the centuries and utilizing them in their publicity campaigns in this modern day of advertising. This painting is called American Gothic, and it was painted by Wood in 1930, and it brought him instant fame. It is a little colloquial to us today. In fact, Wood actually is out of favor, so to speak, in the art world. But in the American scene, he very definitely has a place, and maybe when we get far enough away from him in the perspective of time, we'll understand what importance, if he did have any, to the development of American painting. Even now, 40 years later, after this painting was completed, we can sort of analyze the situation and find out what in the world ever made Wood do it in the first place. After the First World War, when America had been sort of thrust from their period of isolation into a period of sort of international involvement, to the period of the 1920s, where there was a great sort of rise of modernism on a European scale, sort of a sophistication of this international flavor that influenced the art world. Then in the end of the 1920s, with the crash of Wall Street and the depression that spread over the United States, the problems here were greater than those elsewhere, at least to our way of thinking. And the focus of the American public immediately went back in on itself. Rather than looking outward, we were trying to solve our own domestic problems. In this way, the center of art, reflecting the times, also turned inward, a rejection of the European continental style, or the effete moderns, as Wood and Benton and Curry called the group of European painters. The center of art even switched, in America at least, today it remained centered in Paris, though worldwide, but it switched mainly from the New York City scene to the Midwestern United States, the farmlands, the breadbasket of the United States, the Farm Belt, the interior. And there was a great flurry and popularity of this typical Midwestern type painting, such as Thomas Hart Benton did, Curry, and also Grant Wood, probably the most renowned of the three. Wood set up this composition, American Gothic, really as a satire, and then sort of had to backtrack a little bit when its popularity grew to such bounds. The people that he had pose for him were his sister and his dentist. He selected a house that he had seen from Iowa and placed it in the background. This is Wood's masterpiece. He did not achieve the greatness in any of his later paintings. And even in the late 30s, when he was very ill, hospitalized, visited by Benton, he said that he realized that his art style was passé, that it was not of the time, and that if he ever got well again, he would leave the hospital, change his name, and develop a whole new style or technique, that the farmlands that Grant Wood painted were as dead as he might be. He never had a chance to do this. He remained hospitalized until the 1940s when he died. In analyzing the American Gothic, it's a beautiful, simple composition that really does epitomize the strength of the American farmer. He didn't want to irritate the people in Iowa, so he maintained that the man was just a businessman and his wife, but then he never could explain why the businessman was holding the pitchfork. In this sort of hard-edged, realistic, traditional style that Wood developed, especially in this one, an early one, you have a very faithful representation of the two people. The man is making direct contact with you as the viewer, sort of pinning you down with that piercing stare that he has. Everyone, at any point in the room, he is looking directly at you. The wife, a little softer with the rounded forms and the little rick-rack braid around the apron, the little medallion or the pin in the neat starched white collar, has sort of glanced away. Her hairdo, skinned tightly over the skull, repeats almost the same motif as the Gothic window, the pointed arch, in the gable of the house that's behind them. You don't see much of the land around. You see some trees peeking in and around. But here you have a very staunch couple that you feel are very solid, rock hard, that have endured considerably, that are being portrayed as representatives of this Midwestern Americana. And the house very typical of the earlier sort of Victorian period, of where they symbolized the Gothic form with the gingerbread work, as it is called, and decoration on these typical Midwestern farmhouses. Wood achieved instant success with this, and his whole life is based on the popularity and the fame of this one painting. It's about 25 by 30 inches tall. Slide, please. This is also a portrait, and we'll see the portraits first before we go into his landscapes. And this one is of his mother-in-law. And it's sort of peculiar that he sort of ironically selected a Sansevieria plant that she's holding, because the nickname of this plant is called Mother's-in-law's tongue. She is wearing approximately the same type dress, the apron with the rick-rack braid, that the woman or the wife in American Gothic is wearing. In this, he has a very nice sort of character study in the portrait. There are a few wrinkles, but most of Wood's surfaces are clean, smooth, sort of patterned and designed. They're full-formed, they're rounded, but there are no scars or mars on the surface. It's clean, well-cut, well-defined. In the background, you see some of the landscape showing. The red house over on the left-hand side, the windmill above her shoulder on the right-hand side, the little stream meandering around, and some indication of the round sort of lollipop trees, the fullness, the richness of the American landscape that Wood stylized. Slide, please. This is sort of an interesting painting, but completely unsuccessful, and it is a self-portrait. And it shows Wood with some of his neighbors gathered around behind him, watching him paint on a canvas. It is a little dark in this slide, but it is more or less illustration rather than composition, much the same manner of fashion that Norman Rockwell uses later on in his illustrations. The portraits are well represented, except they become just two individual people. They're not symbolic of any area or group. It's just sort of a nice little conversation piece done in a slightly unusual fashion of sort of looking at the mirror image of what the artist is painting. The contact that is made here is almost that he might be painting you. Slide, please. Probably one of the most delightful, and again, with a deep satirical intent, is the painting of Wood's called Daughters of the American Revolution. In this, he has gathered three ladies together that are obviously at a coffee or a tea, since one of them is very delicately handling the teacup, and he places them with all their staunchness, their background, their sort of rigidity, even one that is on the far left that is trying to muster up a smile or some sort of pleasant expression. And it is almost as typical in its time and fashion as, say, modern-day newspaper photographs are taken of approximately the same scene and gender. He uses the very rigid framework on this, as he did in American Gothic, in repeating forms as the window to the lady's hair. In this one you have the sort of three verticals, the ladies, with the strong oval effect of the head, and then the large painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, or the reprint of it, that sort of sets the time element of the background of this painting. The ladies with their dresses are strictly 1930s. Their hairdos for the ladies of this type would be a very definite period piece. But with the inclusion of the Washington painting in the background, it brings in the symbolism of sort of a little historical data that ties these ladies, especially with the title of the picture. But even if you weren't given a title to this picture, you could certainly formulate your own opinion as to time, effort, the background, everything about it. Even without the title, you would pretty well hit the right period and meaning of this group portrait. Slide, please. In his landscapes, Wood almost develops a Walt Disney character in his work. They're completely unrealistic, and yet they're done in a realistic, stylized fashion. You know immediately what everything is. There's no obscuring any detail or any form or shape. This one's called Paul Revere's Ride, and it's a little bit darker than he usually does it, because he usually paints it in very broad sunlight. These things were taken from actual places, and then he would stylize them into his own interpretation. The trees are big, round, sort of lollipop cotton balls. The ground swell in these sort of rising, undulating hills. The road in this one sort of snakes through the whole composition like a beautiful satin ribbon. And you see, as Paul Revere has passed by, the lights shining in the windows of the homes and reflecting out onto the pavement or to the road. This is a historical piece that seems like it belongs in a children's picture book rather than in fine art museums. But this was sort of the attitude of the American public in the 1930s. It was sort of a childish thing, a retrenching of an economic situation, and really a sort of a self-attitude. Slide, please. The rest of his things are usually sort of what we call genre scenes, G-E-N-R-E, sort of everyday, common occurrences that you might see anywhere, depicting them with sort of an objective eye. The man is digging up the garden into the black, rich soil that he turns up. Again, all of Wood's work of this period of time shows the richness and the abundance of the United States, especially the farmlands of the Midwestern United States. The architecture is very typical, although they almost seem to be like little miniature replicas of a Monopoly set, rather than anything that might actually be sitting out in somebody's piece of property. Everything is stylized, and then when he gets to the figures, although they're fairly realistically done, they're still smoothed over. There's a soft quality about them, an unreal effect. Slide, please. Wood was criticized during his time, especially in the 30s, for plowing his fields wrong. A lot of times, they would say that the way he would plow his fields, when many of the Midwestern plains were being ruined by wrong plowing, that the rain would just erode and wash away his fields. And on some of his paintings, he was requested to change the pattern, or at least learn contour plowing, so that there would be some conservation of some lands in the farmlands in the United States. These are really picture book stories, the ideal land, the ideal landscape. Rich, abundant, sort of bulging with their shapes. The hills sort of pile one on top of another. They're soft curving lines, almost feminine shapes. There's nothing harsh or angular in any of Wood's paintings. And then the surface is meticulously done, smoothed over with soft sable brushes, so that you see no stroke of the artist's work left exposed. Slide, please. The details are quite fun to find in Grant Wood's paintings. In this one, where the fields have been plowed, the land is rich, the trees are these nice, soft, sort of cotton ball puffs that have been put together, and the houses tucked neatly into the back landscape. It presents a very beautiful picture of the mid-1930s in the American farming land. The colors are quite rich, not dark or dim, much more on a bright scale. Slide, please. He was aligned with the group, as I mentioned, Benton and Curry, in sort of depicting in a realistic style the happenings of the farmland and of the farmers. This one has a nice sort of abstract quality in its work, almost reminiscent of the German Blue Rider group, which was an early expressionist group in Germany around the first of the 20th century. But they sort of abstracted forms into this sensuous earth patterns. Then he has the nice little tree in bloom that sort of adds interest in the lower right-hand corner, almost too far. Slide, please. As I've mentioned, Wood is in disfavor right now at the moment. But his paintings do command fairly high prices because he is of a certain period of the development of American painting, and probably one of the most enjoyable of that group. Slide, please. This one called Arbor Day. The whole group of school children around the typical little farm community type schoolhouse, or the one-room schoolhouse, with the teacher, and they're digging the hole to plant the tree. His sunlight effect is fairly direct, and this causes nice, strong, sharp shadows. Within each area, it's fairly smooth, no changes of tone, sort of almost like flat pattern, or where one area might shade subtly or slightly to a light or a dark edge. Slide, please. The review today, we will begin with the first painter that we studied this semester, John Singleton Copley, C-O-P-L-E-Y, self-trained American colonial painter, did fairly elegant portraits in a casual style with great attention to the reality of the face, or the interpretation, getting a likeness, and attention to drapery, materials, and the other elements that go in to make the composition. Slide, please. Gilbert Stuart was a later American colonial or Federalist painter whose style was a little more softer, more atmospheric. he also concentrated much more on the character of the person rather than the overall composition. Most of his paintings were strictly portraits, sort of from waist or bust height, changing the background to create sort of an atmosphere behind the head, and working up in translucent tones over the face that gave a depth of coloring to his facial coloring. Slide, please. George Caleb Bingham was one of the first group of painters, much as Grant Wood, we've discussed today, turned inward looking at the abundance and grandeur of the United States. But at this point, approximately 100 years earlier, they were just discovering this grandeur, so it was really virgin territory that they were looking at. After his study in Dusseldorf, he returned to the United States and painted a much more grandiose view of the landscape. He also did the river boatman paintings on the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. Slide, please. Thomas Eakins was the American realist painter of the late 19th century, following the Civil War period. A great devotee to anatomy, was just convinced that he had to portray everything in absolute exact terms, correctness, shadows, perspective. Many times would build models to this point of where he could study what would happen to lights and shadows. Did sporting events, very unflattering portraits. Slide, please. James McNeill Whistler, W-H-I-S-T-L-E-R, was an American who lived most of his years in Europe, sort of as a continental American, a sophisticate, assuming some of the traditions and styles of the European art colonies. He did portraits in very close color harmonies and landscapes that were just slight blurs or indications of the objects. Very close colored harmonies based on a classic motif of the golden mean, the perfect proportioning. Slide, please. Albert Pinkham Ryder, R-Y-D-E-R, was sort of a poet, working in paintings that almost delve into the subconscious or the dream world, based on boats and ships sailing toward the unknown, Shakespeare, the Bible, and the opera. His style was large, blobby, simplified areas built up in thick, rich textures, but a great simplification of pattern, basically light against dark. Slide, please. Winslow Homer was also an American sort of prose painter. Painted the outdoors, mainly man fighting against the elements. He painted the wild sea scenes against the main coast, and also the sun-drenched scenes of the Bahama Islands, also watercolors of the Appalachian areas. He did work in oil, although he developed and is known mainly as a watercolorist. Slide, please. John Sloan was one of the Ashcan group. Around the first part of the 20th century in New York, the group selected subject matters of everyday scenes that they would see around them, the city and life in the city. They did not glorify anything, nor did they degrade it, but they just presented sort of an objective view using it as subject matter. Slide, please. Georgia O'Keeffe, O-K-E-E-F-F-E, is one of the pioneer modern American painters. After her first trip to New Mexico in the late 1920s, she found skulls and bones that she started using as subject matter in her paintings. Also flowers that would be enlarged, filling the whole canvases. In style, she is also aligned in style only, not content, with Grant Wood, in that the surfaces are clean, crisp-edged, well delineated, but usually in an abstract vein centering on a single object. Slide, please. And Grant Wood, mid-1930 American painter, showing the American farmland of the Midwest during the 1930s, showing the abundance and the sort of graciousness of the American land in a stylized, realistic fashion. Clear the machine, please.
And the primitives that, unlike Grant Wood, did not have perspective. Grant Wood did have perspective. But the primitives put in all the detail. They did stylize their landscapes, and just through lack of study and ability, the portraits look sort of peculiar at times, but a great charming representation of the colonial period of the United States. Slide, please.
May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Stuart Davis, D-A-V-I-S. Put in the first slide, please. Stuart Davis is hard to classify or put into a classification of American painting. He was born in 1894 and died somewhere around 1967, and is one of the most regarded top modern painters that America has produced. He started fairly early. His parents gave him an early art education because both of them were interested in art, and art objects were around their home, and started studying in Philadelphia with what was the beginning of the AIT, or the Ashcan School. And about the same time that Robert Henri, the leader and teacher of the Ashcan group, moved to New York, so did the Davis family, moving to East Orange, New Jersey. He studied with Robert Henri. The family were friends with Lukes, Sloan, Bellows, many of the members that were responsible for this early art movement of modern art in the United States. Slide, please. As with most beginning painters, you have approximately three areas that their work falls into. Their early work, which shows great influence of their teachers or whomever they were influenced by, shows up in their work. You have their mature work of developing their own style and interpretation, and then usually a culmination of their late work, depending, of course, how long they lived and how they developed or how they changed. These early sort of genre scenes, this one's sort of a romanticized version of just New York street scene, is so reminiscent of the Ashcan group that it really shows nothing of what we really expect to see in a Stuart Davis painting. Where most art movements began, developed, Davis still is sort of a renegade of it, sticking to subject matter even in his most abstract paintings. Slide, please. Around the early teens, still influenced by Impressionist paintings after a trip to Europe, in the broken up splotches of color, and I'm sorry these slides are so terrible in color, they're all very much red. We still don't see any inkling of what the mature style of Davis would be. Now, with the teachings of Henri, where the subject became more important than the technique, Davis adhered to this fact And in all of his painting, there's usually identifiable subject matter, where the subject becomes design, where the pattern flattens out, the color becomes bold. But we will see these in his later paintings. Slide, please. He did some illustrations for a magazine called The Masses. And then in the 20s, possibly the only category that you might file Davis under would be the international Cubist style. Now, from 1910 on, with the introduction of Cubism by Picasso and Bloch, and this is a style of painting where objects are made into geometric shapes, flattened out, sliced up, rearranged, so that you have a more angular presentation of the object that shows all sides of the object at one time, and then especially the introduction of collage in the 1920s by Picasso, of where objects were actually glued onto the surface and used as part of the decoration. These are very important influences in Davis's work. He did spend some time in Paris in the 1920s, and we'll see some of these flattened, patterned street scenes, slightly picturesque in their presentation. This one, which was a very early one, and one of his great early masterpieces, is called the American Tobacco Company. And he was commissioned by this company as a large piece of decoration for their office. He has taken the symbols. Of course, the Lucky Strike package has changed considerably today over the years. But at the time that Davis did this, it was sort of an olive green color that had the red medallion bullseye in the center of the package. And then it was sort of accented with some brilliant red patterns. But he takes the sort of the symbols of the company, of the packaging, and rearranges them into a large abstract composition, and yet it's completely identifiable with the subject and the subject matter. Slide, please. His Paris street scenes are very linear, where color just plays a decorative addition between the lines. The lines are fairly rigid and abstract. And he did quite a few of these street scenes in the 1920s of different areas around Paris. Slide, please. You have the feeling that they're almost the collage method of Picasso, where these bits of color might be glued on with the design superimposed on the surface. All of these were painted, and even though some of his later paintings look very mechanical, when you see an original, you do see brush strokes of how he applies paint, or how the paint itself crusts up along an edge where he has run the brush to cut a clean line. Where they become extremely mechanical looking in the slide reproduction. In the original, you do have a feeling of the immediacy or the presence of the artist and the quality with which he covers the surface of the canvas. A tiny little Stuart Davis, about 8 by 10 inches, will sell for over $2,500 today. Slide, please. When he felt like these little French scenes in his abstracts were going nowhere, that he had to analyze the subject matter, he went back to the teachings of Henri, and listening that the subject is most important, and even though he combines it with this geometric shape and pattern, he decided to concentrate on the subject matter, evolving his interpretation through a series of paintings based on the same object. And in his studio in Paris, he took mundane things like an egg beater, a mandolin, a little jar, and placed them on his table, nailing them down so that their position would not change. And he started working on these simple objects in a series of paintings where he begins to simplify some more, finally getting down to the barest essentials of still retaining the identity of the object and yet expressed in its most simple, direct terms. His colors become quite brilliant and primary at this time, with lots of use of red, yellows, and blues. And then later on in the 1940, when the jazz period was influencing Mondrian's work and many of the artists' work, his colors become volatile and violent and brilliant. Slide, please. In this one, which is the salt shaker, he takes a simple thing like the little dime store variety of glass octagon-shaped based salt shaker and works it in a pattern of these repeating stripes that continue across the entire background. The object has been sort of opened up, flattened out, with the addition of the letters, which were very popular in use of the French painters of the period that he was studying in France. They found the design and the flatness of letters a very good addition to their compositions, with an indication of the letter S for salt and the little sprinkling of what might possibly be the top that is enclosed within the shape of the salt shaker or the salt itself. And then he gives a tiny little twist. The only three-dimensional quality about this work is this sort of strong diagonal handle that comes in from the upper right-hand side that all of a sudden as a flat metal bar twists on edge with the very flat shading and gives a fraction of an inch of depth to this work. Basically, all of the things are flattened out to the flat surface of the canvas, not trying to create a distance, not trying to create an illusion, but he certainly retains all the essential parts of the object in presenting it in this extremely simplified abstract form. Slide, please. In many of his work, he vignettes them. In other words, they sort of contain a self-border or a self-matting or frame. The objects almost float loosely within the composition, not exactly squared off, but sort of breaking into the matting or the frame. The strong dark pattern or this linear pattern overlaying on top of the very brilliant patches of color. This is one commemorating Gettysburg. Slide, please. Sometimes he goes into the pure abstract, and I must say these colors are still very washed out and unlike the originals. The reds would practically put your eyes out. There are brilliant primary colors, and he uses these red, oranges, yellows, and with this very dark black striping around it as an overlay pattern. Some of these are based on jazz themes, some of them based on sort of the feeling of the city. Slide, please. You might find recognizable objects within this sort of calligraphy of abstract pattern and these little broken angles of design. Again, these forms sort of float, occupying and filling the space, and there's a little feeling of maybe the three-dimension by some of these shapes overlapping and then repeating again on the opposite side of another shape. Slide, please. During the 1930s, in the midst of the American Depression, when most of the art standards turned toward the Midwest, as we saw in Grant Wood's sort of bucolic paintings last week, Stuart Davis remained aloof from this general working area, and even though he was considered and regarded very highly in the art fields, he never sunk to the social propaganda type paintings of the WPA projects during the 1930s, his style remained constant in this sort of abstracted, broken form. Slide, please. When his compositions get complicated, they become almost an overall pattern of jumbled designs. And yet there is an organization to all of these little bits and pieces that finally join together in a very sort of brilliant, exciting composition. He uses a lot of times this sort of wiggly, abstract line as part of the design, and colors breaking on top of colors. It's a constant play of pattern against pattern. Slide, please. His works are prized by any museum in the world today. Slide, please. And a slight return to the narrative with the street scene, but it is much more complicated than the sort of simple structures and blocky planes of color that he used in his early Parisian days. Again, letters still form an important part in breaking up the pattern of his compositions. Slide, please. Slide, please.